Julian Sinclair stood in the doorway of his father's study in the house on Brays Bayou in Houston, Texas on a Saturday afternoon in October, holding a folder his sister Octavia had handed him 20 minutes earlier in the driveway before either of them had gone inside. And Colette Sinclair was seated behind his father's desk, not his father, Colette, with a set of documents spread in front of her, and a new attorney Julian had never met sitting in the chair beside her. And Emmett Sinclair, 79 years old, was seated in the reading chair by the window where he had sat every afternoon of Julian's entire life. Looking, Julian would say later, like a guest in his own study rather than the man who had built the business that paid for that house. Colette looked up when Julian and Octavia walked in and said, with the specific bright composure of someone who has rehearsed exactly this moment, "We were just finalizing some updates to your father's estate plan, nothing to worry about." And Octavia, who had been the one to receive a call from a family friend 3 days earlier warning her that something was happening at the house that she needed to see for herself, said, "What kind of updates?" And the attorney beside Colette, a man Julian would later learn had been retained exclusively by Colette rather than jointly by the family, said that the details were confidential between attorney and client, and Emmett, from the reading chair, said nothing at all, and Julian looked at his father's face for a long moment and understood, with the specific cold clarity of a son seeing something he had been avoiding seeing for 2 years, that his father was not fully following what was happening in his own study, that Colette had chosen this particular Saturday afternoon deliberately, on a day Julian and Octavia normally worked, believing neither of them would be there to see it. And Octavia said, "We are not leaving this room until we understand exactly what is being signed and why." And Colette's composure held for exactly as long as it took Julian to set the folder Octavia had given him down on the desk directly in front of the unfamiliar attorney and say, "Before anyone signs anything else in this house, I need you to look at something and stay with me." Because what was inside that folder, a folder that Julian and Octavia had picked up from a Houston attorney named Franklin Doucette only that morning, is the reason that every document Colette had spent 18 months quietly preparing was, in the specific and permanent language of Texas trust law, already meaningless before she had ever drafted the first page of it. And what Colette Sinclair did not know, sitting behind a desk in a house she believed she was one signature away from fully controlling, was that Emmett Sinclair had made the single most important financial decision of his life nearly 6 years earlier, more than 4 years before he had ever met her, in the specific weeks after burying his first wife, when grief had made him certain of exactly one thing, that his children were never, under any circumstance he could imagine, going to be left vulnerable to a future he could not predict. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now if you have not already, because we tell the stories on this channel that nobody else is telling, and this community is growing every single day. Drop your location in the comments right now and tell us, if you walked into a room and found a new spouse finalizing estate documents with your aging parent without the rest of the family present, what would your first words be? We read every single comment, and we want to hear from you before this story is over. Emmett Sinclair was born in Houston's 3rd Ward in 1946, the son of a man who had spent 30 years working the counter at a hardware store on Dowling Street, and who had told his son, more than once, that the difference between a job and a business was that a business kept working for you even on the days you could not be there yourself. Emmett carried that lesson into 1971 when he opened his first auto parts storefront on a corner lot his father had helped him secure financing for, a single small building with a hand-painted sign and a stock of parts Emmett had purchased on credit he was not entirely certain he would be able to repay. He worked 6 days a week for the first 3 years, learning every part number and every customer's specific vehicle by heart, building the kind of reputation in the 3rd Ward and the neighborhoods around it that comes only from consistency, sustained far longer than most people are willing to sustain it. And the business grew, a second location in 1976, a third in 1981, and by the time Emmett was 60, he had 11 locations across Southeast Texas. A business built on the specific, unglamorous consistency of showing up every day and treating every customer, whether they were buying a single air filter or replacing an entire transmission, with the same patient respect his own father had shown customers at that hardware store counter decades earlier. He had married Delphine in 1975, a schoolteacher he had met at a church social 2 years earlier, and Julian has told me that his parents' courtship as his mother used to describe it, was built on a very simple foundation. Delphine had told Emmett, on their second date, that she had watched enough men in her life talk about their ambitions without ever building anything real, and that she was not interested in promises. She was interested in evidence, and Emmett, rather than being offended, had told her that was the most sensible thing anyone had ever said to him on a date. And he had spent the following 2 years showing her evidence rather than making promises, and together they raised 2 children in the house on Brays Bayou that Emmett bought with the profits of his third store, a house Delphine had chosen specifically for its wide front porch, telling Emmett she wanted a home where the family could sit together in the evenings and actually see their neighbors passing by, rather than retreating immediately behind closed doors. And that porch became, over the following decades, the specific gathering place for nearly every important family conversation, birthdays announced there, college acceptance letters read aloud there, and eventually, in February of 2020, the place where Julian and Octavia sat with their father the evening after their mother's funeral. None of them quite able to go inside yet. Delphine was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2019, and the 11 months that followed were, by everyone's account, the hardest period the family had ever collectively lived through. Emmett drove Delphine to every treatment himself, refusing to let either of his children take time away from their own young families to do it. Sitting in waiting rooms for hours with the same patient consistency he had brought to 4 decades of building his business. And there was a specific evening, roughly 7 months into the illness, that Octavia has described to me in detail, sitting with both of her parents on that same front porch on an unusually cool October evening. Delphine, weak but lucid, had taken both of her husband's hands in hers and told him directly that she needed him to promise her something. Not that he would be fine. She said she knew better than to ask for a promise neither of them could guarantee, but that whatever happened to her, he would make absolutely certain their children never had to wonder whether they were provided for, that he would not let grief or loneliness or anyone's future influence ever put what they had built together at risk, and Emmett had promised her exactly that. Sitting on the porch she had chosen 20 years earlier, so the family could sit together in the evenings. And Octavia has told me that promise, more than any single legal document, was the real origin of everything that followed. Delphine died in February of 2020, and Emmett, who had spent 45 years building a business by solving problems, discovered that this was the one problem no amount of persistence or capital could solve. Julian remembers the specific quality of his father's grief in those first weeks, not loud, not dramatic, but a kind of stunned stillness that Julian had never seen in his father before. Emmett sitting for long stretches in the reading chair by the study window without reading anything at all. And 6 weeks after the funeral, on a Tuesday evening, Julian came by the house to check on him and found his father in that same chair, and Emmett said, without much preamble, "Julian, your mother and I built everything together, and I do not know what is coming for me now. I do not know how long I have or what condition I will be in when whatever comes for me arrives, and I need to make sure that whatever happens to me, you and your sister are protected completely, regardless of any decision I make later that I am not in a position to make clearly." And Julian, sitting across from his father in the specific silence that follows a sentence like that, understood that his father was not simply grieving. He was already, in the middle of the worst weeks of his life, beginning to plan for a future he could not see the shape of yet. That conversation was the beginning of what Emmett would spend the following 4 months doing, quietly, and without significant announcement to anyone outside the immediate process. He retained a Houston estate planning and trust attorney named Franklin Doucette, a man who had been recommended to him by his own longtime business accountant. And Emmett sat across from Franklin in his downtown Houston office on a rainy Thursday morning in March of 2020 and explained exactly what he had told Julian, that he had just watched his wife die after 11 months of illness, that he understood in a way he had never fully understood before how quickly and completely a person's capacity to make sound decisions could be taken from them, and that he wanted to structure his estate in a way that protected his children's inheritance permanently, regardless of anything that happened to him personally in the years that followed, regardless of his health, regardless of any future relationship he might or might not enter into, regardless of anyone's future influence over him. Franklin listened to all of this without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad, and when Emmett finished, Franklin told him that what he was describing was best accomplished through an irrevocable trust, a specific legal structure that, once properly funded and executed, could not be altered, amended, or revoked by Emmett himself. Not by a court, not by any future spouse, not even, critically, by Emmett. Changing his own mind later, Franklin explained this last point with particular care. Leaning forward across his desk, he told Emmett that an irrevocable trust was, by its legal definition, a decision that removed Emmett's own future ability to reverse it, that this was not a minor technical detail, but the entire point of the structure, and he asked Emmett directly, more than once, across that meeting and a follow-up meeting 2 weeks later, whether he understood the full weight and permanence of what he was proposing, and Emmett said, both times, that he understood completely, and he said something to Franklin in that first meeting that Franklin would remember with particular clarity nearly 6 years later when the entire situation finally came to a head. He said, "Franklin, I am not trying to protect this money from myself as I am today. I am trying to protect it from a version of myself that grief or illness or age might someday create. A version of me that a stranger with bad intentions could take advantage of, and I would rather make that decision now, while I am completely certain of what I want, than leave it to chance later." Over the following 4 months, Franklin Doucette structured an irrevocable trust that transferred the majority of Emmett's business holdings, the auto parts company itself along with 3 commercial properties Emmett owned outright, into the trust, naming Julian and Octavia as the trust's beneficiaries in equal shares, with a provision that Emmett would continue to receive income generated by the business for the remainder of his life, ensuring he retained full financial comfort and independence, but with the principal assets themselves permanently and irrevocably designated to pass to his children, structured specifically so that no future will, no future spouse's claim, and no future decision by Emmett himself could redirect them. The trust was signed, funded, and fully executed in June of 2020, for months after Delphine's death, and, critically, more than 4 years before Emmett would meet Colette. Franklin filed the trust documentation according to Texas law, and Emmett, satisfied that he had done what he set out to do, put the entire matter out of his conscious daily thinking. He did not discuss the specific details of the trust structure with Julian or Octavia beyond telling them, once, that he had, in his words, taken care of things properly, and both of his children, trusting their father's judgment completely and not wanting to press him on a subject still raw with grief, did not ask for further specifics, a decision that would matter enormously. Nearly 6 years later, Colette entered Emmett's life in the fall of 2021 at a Houston charity gala that Emmett had attended reluctantly at the urging of a longtime business associate who had spent months telling him it was time to get out of the house. Colette was 52, 17 years younger than Emmett, elegant and socially confident in a way that Emmett, still navigating the specific loneliness of widowhood, found genuinely captivating. She worked in luxury real estate and moved through Houston's social circles with an ease that Emmett, a man who had spent his entire life focused on auto parts rather than galas, found himself admiring rather than questioning. At that first gala, she had asked him detailed, genuinely interested questions about how he had built his business, listening with what seemed like real attention rather than polite patience, and Emmett, who had spent a year and a half largely avoiding social settings entirely, told Julian afterward that talking to her had felt like remembering he was still a person capable of being interesting to someone. They dated for a little over a year, dinners, weekend trips, the specific rhythm of 2 adults building a relationship carefully, and married in the spring of 2023 in a small ceremony that Julian and Octavia attended with what they would both later describe as cautious but genuine hope. They wanted their father to be happy. They had watched him carry the weight of their mother's death for 3 years, and Colette, in those early months, was warm toward both of them, attentive, generous with her time. She remembered Octavia's students by name from conversations months earlier. She asked Julian about his own children's school activities, and Julian in particular has told me he spent the first year of his father's second marriage actively working to give Colette the benefit of every doubt, telling himself that his own protectiveness toward his father was natural but should not be allowed to poison a relationship that seemed, on its own evidence, to be making Emmett genuinely happy again. The shift began, according to both Julian and Octavia, roughly 18 months into the marriage. and it began, as these shifts almost always do, with explanations that were individually reasonable. Colette suggested that family Sunday dinners, a tradition Delphine had started decades earlier and that Emmett had continued faithfully even through his years of widowhood, should move to a bi-weekly rather than weekly schedule, because Emmett, she said, needed more quiet time to rest, and Octavia remembers feeling a small private resistance to this suggestion that she talked herself out of at the time, telling herself that Colette knew her father's daily rhythms better than she did now. Julian and Octavia, not wanting to seem possessive of their father's time, agreed. Colette began handling more of Emmett's scheduling, his medical appointments, his correspondence, explaining that this was simply easier given how busy Julian and Octavia both were with their own careers and families. There was a specific incident in late 2023 that Julian has returned to many times since. He had called the house on a Wednesday evening simply to check in, and Colette had answered and told him that his father was resting and did not want to be disturbed. And Julian, hanging up the phone, had felt a small specific unease he could not fully name at the time, the sense that his father, a man who had never in Julian's entire life declined to take a call from his own son, had somehow acquired a gatekeeper without anyone formally deciding that he needed one. And Emmett, who had begun experiencing the first subtle signs of cognitive decline in late 2023, small memory lapses, occasional confusion about dates and recent conversations, symptoms that would eventually be diagnosed as early-stage vascular dementia in the spring of 2024, increasingly deferred to Colette's management of his daily life in a way that felt, in any individual instance, simply practical. The diagnosis itself, delivered by Emmett's longtime physician in April of 2024, was the specific hinge point that both Julian and Octavia now identify as the moment everything accelerated. Colette was present at the diagnostic appointment, and Julian and Octavia were not, having been told by Colette that it was simply a routine follow-up not requiring the whole family. And when Julian learned, 3 days later, what the appointment had actually been for, he called Colette directly and asked why. He had not been told in advance, and Colette said that she had not wanted to worry him unnecessarily until she understood the full picture herself, a response that Julian, in the moment, accepted, but that he has told me he has thought about many times since as the first clear instance of Colette positioning herself as the sole gatekeeper of information about his father's health and decision-making. Octavia, when she learned of the diagnosis secondhand from her brother rather than from her own father or stepmother, drove to the house that same evening and found Emmett sitting alone in the study. And when she asked him directly how he was feeling about the diagnosis, he seemed, she has told me, genuinely uncertain of some of the specific details, as though the appointment itself had already begun to blur slightly in his memory, which was, as Octavia would only later fully understand, one of the earliest visible symptoms of the condition itself. Over the following 14 months, the pattern deepened in ways that were individually small and collectively significant. Colette began describing Julian and Octavia's visits to Emmett as tiring for him, suggesting they call ahead rather than dropping by, then suggesting they call ahead and expect shorter visits. Then, by the early months of 2025, Julian noticed that his calls to the house were increasingly answered by Colette rather than his father, with Colette explaining that Emmett was resting or not feeling up to a long conversation. There was a specific afternoon in February of 2025 when Julian drove to the house unannounced, something he rarely did anymore given the pattern that had developed, and found his father alone in the front room while Colette was out, and Emmett, seeing his son, had said, with a specific and unguarded warmth Julian had not heard in months, "Julian, I was hoping you would come by." And the two of them had talked for nearly an hour, an ordinary, easy conversation that reminded Julian sharply of exactly how much he had been missing. And when Colette returned and found them together, her expression, Julian has told me, shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, a specific tightening that Julian recognized only in retrospect as the expression of someone whose careful management of a situation had just been interrupted. Octavia experienced the same broad pattern independently through her own visits, and when the two siblings compared notes over dinner one evening in March of 2025, they realized, for the first time explicitly rather than as a series of individually dismissible incidents, that they had not had an unsupervised conversation with their father in nearly 4 months. It was Octavia who received the phone call in September of 2025 from Marguerite Holloway, a longtime family friend who had known Emmett since before Julian was born and who still lived 2 streets over from the house on Brays Bayou. Marguerite told Octavia that she had seen an unfamiliar car in the driveway several times over the previous month, and that she had run into Colette at the grocery store, and Colette had mentioned, in passing and with what Marguerite described as slightly too much emphasis, that she and Emmett were finally getting his affairs properly organized. Marguerite said she did not know exactly what that meant, but that something about the way Colette said it had stayed with her, and she thought Octavia should know. Octavia called Julian that same evening, and the two of them made a decision that would prove to be the second most important decision of this entire story. They called Franklin Doucette. Julian remembered his father mentioning Franklin's name once, years earlier, in the context of having taken care of things properly after their mother's death, and Julian, an accountant himself who understood the general shape of estate planning even without knowing the specifics of his father's arrangements, called Franklin's office and asked, cautiously, whether Franklin had ever done work for Emmett Sinclair. Franklin, bound by attorney-client privilege regarding the specifics of any existing arrangement but not prevented from confirming that a relationship existed, told Julian that yes, he had worked with Emmett extensively, and that given what Julian was describing, the apparent isolation, the new attorney Marguerite had mentioned seeing Colette's car parked near, the accelerating pattern, Franklin strongly recommended that Julian and Octavia come into his office as soon as possible. Not to change anything Emmett had done, Franklin was careful to specify, but to understand exactly what protections already existed so that the family could respond to whatever was happening with accurate information rather than fear. Julian and Octavia sat across from Franklin Doucette in his downtown office on a Thursday morning in early October, and Franklin, after confirming his own records and satisfying himself of the appropriate legal basis for sharing the information given the apparent circumstances, told them what their father had done nearly 6 years earlier, the Irrevocable Trust, structured and fully executed in June of 2020, for months after Delphine's death, and more than 4 years before Emmett had ever met Colette, holding the auto parts business and 3 commercial properties, with Julian and Octavia named as equal beneficiaries. Franklin explained, in careful and precise language, that because the trust was irrevocable, because it had been executed years before the marriage to Colette and funded entirely with assets Emmett owned before that marriage began, the trust assets were not marital property under Texas law regardless of anything Colette might now be attempting to arrange, and that no document Colette was currently working to have Emmett sign, no matter how it was structured, could reach assets that Emmett himself had permanently and legally relinquished direct control over 5 years before he ever knew Colette existed. Franklin told them, "We need to prepare a summary of this trust's existence and structure, not to threaten anyone with it, but because I believe, given the pattern you are describing, that a moment is coming very soon where you are going to need to put this information directly in front of whoever is currently managing your father's affairs, and it needs to be presented clearly enough that there is no ambiguity about what it means." That moment arrived 3 days later, on the Saturday afternoon that opened this story, when Marguerite Holloway called Octavia again, this time to say that she had seen the unfamiliar car, along with a second vehicle Marguerite did not recognize, parked in the Sinclair driveway that very morning, and Octavia called Julian immediately, and the two of them drove to the house together, stopping first at Franklin Doucette's office, which Franklin had specifically told them to do if this exact situation arose, to collect the summary document Franklin had prepared in advance, a clear, plainly worded explanation of the trust's existence, its execution date, and its legal implications, and they arrived at the house on Brays Bayou and walked into the study and found Colette behind Emmett's desk with an unfamiliar attorney and a set of documents already partially signed. And Julian set the folder down in front of the attorney and said, "Before anyone signs anything else in this house, I need you to look at something." What followed in that study over the next several minutes was the specific unraveling that happens when a plan built on an incomplete picture of reality encounters the missing piece all at once. Colette's attorney read through Franklin's summary document with visible and increasing discomfort, and asked Colette, quietly but audibly, whether she had known about the existence of this trust, and Colette for the first time since Julian and Octavia had walked into the room, did not have an immediately composed answer. She said she had not known the specific details, that Emmett had mentioned something vague about arrangements from before their marriage, but had never discussed the specifics with her, and Octavia, standing near the door, said, "You spent 18 months preparing to redirect an estate you never once asked basic questions about." And Colette turned to her, the composure returning briefly, and said that Emmett was a grown man capable of making his own decisions. And Julian said, quietly, "He is a grown man with a documented cognitive diagnosis that you personally sat in the room for, and then kept from the rest of his family." And Julian, watching his father's face throughout this exchange, saw something he had not seen in nearly 2 years, a flicker of the specific sharp attentiveness that had defined Emmett Sinclair for most of Julian's life. And Emmett said, from the reading chair, in a voice that was quieter than it used to be, but unmistakably his own, "I remember, Franklin. I remember doing that after your mother died. I wanted to make sure you and your sister were taken care of no matter what happened to me." And the room went silent in the specific way a room goes silent when the person everyone had been discussing as though he could not fully understand his own situation demonstrates, clearly and unmistakably, that some essential part of him understood it completely. Colette's attorney, reviewing the documents he had brought that day against what Franklin's summary described, told Colette privately, in a conversation Julian partially overheard from the hallway, that the estate plan they had been preparing, which would have given Colette significantly expanded control over Emmett's remaining assets and reduced Julian and Octavia's inheritance to what Texas law required at minimum for children of a first marriage, had been built around an incomplete understanding of what Emmett actually owned outright versus what had already been irrevocably transferred years earlier, and that continuing to pursue the plan as drafted would likely constitute, given Emmett's diagnosed cognitive decline and the apparent pattern of isolation from his other family members, a legally vulnerable position that could expose Colette to serious challenge, both from Julian and Octavia, and potentially from the state itself, if any allegation of undue influence or elder exploitation were formally raised. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now because this story is about to show you exactly what happened over the weeks that followed, and you need to be here for this part. Tell us in the comments. Do you think Emmett fully understood what was happening when he agreed to sign new documents? Or do you think his diagnosis made him genuinely vulnerable to influence he could not fully evaluate? Drop your answer below because we want to hear from you before this story is over. The weeks that followed that Saturday afternoon produced 3 sequential developments that permanently reshaped the situation. The first was that Julian and Octavia, acting on Franklin Doucette's advice, arranged for an independent geriatric care assessment of their father, conducted by a physician with no prior relationship to Colette, and that assessment confirmed both the progression of Emmett's cognitive decline and, significantly, documented specific patterns consistent with social isolation that the assessing physician noted as a risk factor requiring family intervention, a formal medical document that Franklin explained would be significant if any question of undue influence ever needed to be formally addressed. The second development was that Colette, faced with the reality that the trust assets were permanently beyond her reach, and that continuing to pursue expanded control over the remaining assets carried real legal risk given the documented pattern of isolation, made a decision that surprised Julian and Octavia less than it might have surprised someone who had not spent the previous 2 years watching her operate. She did not fight. She did not contest anything. She simply, over the following month, began spending considerably less time at the house on Brays Bayou, and Julian, who had access by then to some of the household financial records as part of the family's broader effort to understand the full picture, noticed that Colette had, in the months before the confrontation, been steadily moving her own personal funds into accounts entirely separate from the household finances, a pattern that suggested to Franklin, when Julian described it to him, that Colette had likely been preparing an exit strategy of her own in parallel with her efforts to secure a larger share of Emmett's estate, hedging against the possibility that either path might eventually be foreclosed to her. The third development, and the one that mattered most to Julian and Octavia personally rather than legally, was the slow and genuine return of unsupervised time with their father. Julian began visiting every Tuesday evening, Octavia every Thursday, and both of them found, in the months that followed, that even with the cognitive decline that was real and progressive and would not reverse, their father was more present, more himself, more able to participate in ordinary conversation. Once the specific pressure of Colette's constant managed presence was no longer shaping every interaction, Emmett could not always remember what had happened the previous week, but he remembered, with striking consistency, the specific decision he had made in Franklin Doucette's office nearly 6 years earlier, and he told Julian more than once during those Tuesday evening visits, with quiet satisfaction, that he had known, somehow, all those years ago, that he needed to protect what mattered before he lost the clarity to protect it himself. Emmett Sinclair is 80 years old now, living in the house on Brays Bayou with part-time professional caregiving support that Julian and Octavia arranged and managed jointly. His cognitive decline has continued its slow progression, some days better than others, and Colette, who filed for divorce 8 months after the confrontation in the study, received what Texas law entitled her to as Emmett's spouse regarding assets acquired during the marriage itself, a settlement that Franklin has described as fair and legally appropriate, but considerably more modest than what she had spent the final 2 years of the marriage attempting to secure. Julian and Octavia see their father regularly now. Julian every Tuesday evening without fail, Octavia every Thursday, and both of them have made a point of restoring the bi-weekly Sunday dinners to their original weekly rhythm. Gathering on the same front porch Delphine chose decades earlier, Emmett does not always remember the specific details of a conversation from the previous week, but he remembers, with striking and consistent clarity, sitting on that porch, and he remembers his wife, and on a good afternoon, sitting with his son or daughter in the late sunlight, he will sometimes say, unprompted, that he is glad he took care of things properly when he still had his mind clear enough to do it right. Julian told me that the thing he thinks about most from the entire experience is not the confrontation in the study and not the 8 weeks that followed it. The thing he thinks about most is a specific detail Franklin mentioned almost as an aside during that first meeting in his office, that his father had said, in 2020, sitting in the same chair Julian now regularly sits in himself. I would rather make that decision now, while I am completely certain of what I want, than leave it to chance. Later, and Julian has told me that sentence has become something close to a guiding principle in his own life since. The specific understanding that protecting the people you love sometimes means making permanent decisions long before you can see the exact shape of the threat those decisions will eventually need to guard against. Julian has since begun his own estate planning, at 47 years old, with 2 young children of his own, a decision he has told me he made directly because of what he watched his father do. Octavia, for her part, has told me that what stays with her most is not the legal outcome at all. It is the specific afternoon in February of 2025 when she learned, secondhand, how much unsupervised time with her father she had already lost without fully realizing it. And she has said that the legal protection Franklin Doucette helped her father build, as important as it turned out to be, was never really the thing that mattered most in the end. What mattered most was simply getting back the Tuesday evenings and the Thursday afternoons, the ordinary, unremarkable time with a father whose mind was slowly leaving him, but whose presence, when it was not being carefully managed by someone else, was still entirely and unmistakably his own. Here is what stays with me about Emmett Sinclair. He sat in a room 4 months after burying his wife and made a decision that would not matter, that would not be tested, that would sit quietly and used for nearly 6 years, until the exact moment it became the single most important thing he had ever done for his children. Colette Sinclair spent 18 months carefully isolating a vulnerable man and preparing documents designed to redirect an inheritance she did not fully understand had already been placed permanently beyond anyone's reach, including, eventually, Emmett's own, and what she could not have known, because Emmett himself had rarely spoken of it in specific terms even to his own children, was that the version of Emmett Sinclair she believed she was maneuvering around, a declining, increasingly dependent man whose judgment she believed she could shape, had made his most important decision years before she ever met him, at a moment when his judgment was sharper and more certain than it would ever be again, precisely because he understood that certainty like that does not last forever, and that the people who love us most sometimes need to be protected from a future version of ourselves we cannot yet see clearly. So here's what I want to ask you before you go. The first question is about Emmett's decision in 2020. He made an irrevocable choice at a moment of grief, permanently giving up his own future ability to change his mind about his children's inheritance. Do you think that was a wise and loving decision? Or do you think there is something troubling about a person permanently removing their own future agency, even in service of protecting people they love? And the second question is about Colette. She spent 18 months isolating a man with a diagnosed cognitive decline in order to secure a larger share of an estate. Do you think she deserves the benefit of the doubt that she genuinely believed she was entitled to more? Or do you think the pattern of isolation itself, regardless of her internal justification, was disqualifying on its own? Drop your answers in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think, and this story is going to produce a comment conversation that runs for a very long time. If this story made you think about the protections that exist or do not exist for someone you love who might someday become vulnerable, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the like button if Emmett Sinclair reminded you of someone you know. And subscribe to Psyche Tales TV because we are telling the stories that matter on this channel, and this community is growing every single day, and we are grateful for every single one of you who is here with us. Take care of yourself. I will see you in the next one.